think we're live. Timothy, do you want to start us with introductions or do you want me to jump on in? Whatever you prefer.
I would love to. Hello and welcome to our second teach-in, which is called Divestment from Fossil Fuels and Black Liberation. We're so glad that you can join us today. And so, just like we did during our first teach-in, we're going to say in the comments on Facebook, write your name, your location, and your pronouns. And then today we're interested in how did you first hear about Juneteenth? For me, I first heard about Juneteenth much later in life. While I was at Union Theological Seminary, I had some black colleagues who talked to me about it, and I joined in. Well, I went and saw a parade in Brooklyn for Juneteenth. So I was introduced to it much later, and but I'm glad that I know about it now. And so in the comments, write down your name, your location, your pronouns. I'm Timothy Watring. I'm here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I'm a he, him, his. And then if you can, please write when did you first hear about Juneteenth? How did you learn about Peace Camp, if you haven't already talked about it? How are you connected with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship? And what kind of expectations you have about Presbyterians and social justice. So we're glad you're here and are joining us. So now I will pass it over to Abby.
Hi, everyone. My name is Abby Mohaupt, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm calling from rural North Texas from a regenerative farm. And I am getting notifications from everybody writing on the Peace Fellowship live video. And so I'm delighted to have all of you with us. I'm the moderator of Fossil Free PCUSA, and I'm also the Director of Education and Training for Green Faith, international interfaith nonprofit based in New Jersey, but committed to international environmental work. And about a year ago, we went, a few of us from Green Faith co-hosted and went to a conference on divestment from fossil fuels in Cape Town, South Africa. And one morning, as I went to pray and prepare for a panel I was on, I found myself in the market and outside of next to the shore, and found these earrings. And so today I wear them as both a connection to our work for divestment, but also an acknowledgement that today is Juneteenth and we celebrate Black liberation. I was listening to Timothy announce the title of our work teach-in today, and I realized that what it sounds like we're talking about is divestment from Black liberation. And we actually mean to say that we want to invest in Black liberation and divest from police brutality. So it's a good reminder to pay attention to how we speak. But welcome to this teach-in. In 2012, Bill McKibben wrote an article called Do the Math. And it was about the fossil fuel industry and climate change, and how the fossil fuel industry had been the largest contributor to climate change, and that climate change was getting worse, and that the people affected by climate change first and worst were people who are poor, women, and Black, Indigenous people of color. And in that article, which was published in Rolling Stone, he talked about the need to do divestment from fossil fuels following the path to, or the international movement to divest from apartheid South Africa that happened in the 70s and 80s and into the early 90s as a way for the international community to provide pressure on the apartheid government in South Africa. So a group of us in the Presbyterian Church heard Bill McKibben go on his Do the Math tour and got connected to each other across the denomination and believed that we would have an easy fight to ask the Presbyterian Church to divest from fossil fuels. And 8 years later, we're still waiting for the church to divest. Though this would have been the General Assembly when we would have, we believe, divested from 3 companies based at least on the recommendation of Mission Responsibility through Investment, who were calling for divestment from Exxon, Motorola, and Marathon. Not Motorola, Marathon, Exxon, and Timothy keeps mouthing Marathon. I'm gonna have to look it up. I just got super focused. It's Valero is the third one. And is it Timothy? Timothy, look it up. Anyways, my credibility as the moderator of Fossil Free PCUSA is going down the tubes, but it's fine. Someone else will take up the mantle because I'm not the only person who does this work. More than 50 presbyteries around our denomination have supported divestment from fossil fuels, calling on the Presbyterian Church to categorically divest from the entire fossil fuel industry, believing that where our treasure is, there our hearts are always. And that is the biblical text that we have so often used in our divestment work. But one of the other texts that we use when we think about caring for creation is the text when Jesus is asked what the heart of the law is. In Luke chapter 10, we read, on one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit the eternal life? What is written in the law? Jesus replied, how do you read it? And the expert in the law answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. What follows then is a discussion of the Good Samaritan, but it is a reminder that when we love God with all our heart and with all our soul and with all our strength and with all our mind, we must do that alongside of loving our neighbor. The gift of responding to climate change is that we as a denomination in the PCUSA have already done the work of loving God with our whole hearts and loving God and with our whole soul and our strength and with all our mind, and have used that as a framework to love all of creation and to respond to climate change. Loving God and responding to climate change with our hearts by creating worship and community building experiences around climate change and ending climate change, to do it with our souls. And I often think about this as not the souls of our spirits, but the soles of our feet, and thinking about that as an advocacy and the ways in which the Presbyterian Church has been an ally for calling for just transitions and staying in the Paris Agreement so that we can dismantle climate change, and to love God with all our strength, with all of who we are as a denomination, and with all our mind, loving God and loving creation through educational tools, books, book studies, connecting people across science and understanding climate change. And doing that, we love our neighbors as ourselves, understanding that when we respond to climate change, we respond to each other and respond to people who are experiencing climate change already. I wonder, as you hear those two texts lifted up as the foundation for our divestment work, if there are other texts in the Bible that you look to as you think about caring for creation. I'm just going to give you a second to respond to that question. What are biblical texts on loving creation or caring for climate change? Answer that in the chat. And then how is your faith community caring for creation with all your heart, or with all your soul, with all your strength, with all your mind? What are ways in which your faith community is caring for the earth? In this pause, I hope that you're responding to that question on Facebook Live. It's such an interesting thing to be on Zoom and not be able to respond to each of you. And yet here we are. What I know about the Presbyterian Church is that there are churches all over our denomination who have added solar panels to their churches. They've had blessings of the animals. They've had community gardens. They've done book studies and have been in the streets for climate marches and have sought climate justice in lots of other ways. And there have been, as I mentioned, over 50 presbyteries who have called for our denomination to divest from fossil fuels. There's also been at least 2 presbyteries who they themselves have divested from fossil fuels. And later this week, you will get in the Peace Camp devotionals a reflection from one of the financial leaders of one of those presbyteries talking about how that happened in San Francisco Presbytery. And then there are churches and individuals who have divested themselves from fossil fuels using both the Board of Pension option for divestment, but also the Presbyterian Foundation option for divestment and fossil fuel investments. Each of those entities and individuals have turned to and lived out the biblical teaching that says that where our treasure is, there our hearts are also. And if we want to love God with our whole hearts, we have to be mindful of where our treasure is, because that's where our heart is also. And that is a text that I've been holding in my heart as we in Presbyterian Peace Fellowship have begun to support the call to defund the police, to divest from police brutality, and to reinvest in other things. That conversation and that call from many of our partners and beloveds feels a little bit scary at first. It feels impossible to divest from police brutality. And yet we as a denomination have been calling for the divestment from fossil fuels for 8 years, have lived into that call to believe and work towards something that seems so impossible and hard. And we have believed that another world is possible. A world without fossil fuels, a world without climate change is possible. And in the same way, we believe that a world without police brutality and the death of Black men at the hands of police is possible. And so my colleague and friend, Allie Wood, is going to talk more about how we make these connections. And I look forward to hearing from you, Alison.
Thanks, Abby. My name is Alison Wood. I use she, her pronouns. I am the accompaniment coordinator with Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and I'm an anti-oppression educator in Tucson, Arizona. And I am excited, grateful for this opportunity to talk about defunding the police and why it matters in the fight for climate justice. So we know that the fight for climate justice is a struggle for investing in community thriving, like I like to talk about it, which means building new systems of care that replace capitalist systems of extraction and consumption. I, and imagine you too, want to live in a world where all people are cared for and no place or person is consumed, which is what we see happening in our police system in the United States, really in the whole carceral system, meaning from the start when folks are kids in the school to prison pipeline through to prisons themselves, that our system of policing and enforcement treats particularly Black and brown people as if they are disposable, as if they are just bodies to be used, not actual human beings. This is part and parcel of the same ideology that fuels climate change, that tells us that the whole world is disposable, is just something for us to be used for our profit. The underlying evils that I see in both climate chaos and police brutality are capitalism and white supremacy and the ways that they interact to dehumanize people, to treat people as though they are things. I believe that if we want a world where no places are disposable, no natural resources are disposable, if we want true climate justice, that hand in hand with that, we have to also act as though we believe that no people are disposable, and acknowledge that we have forever, we as white people, I as a white person, have forever benefited from the labor of Black and brown people without actually valuing them as people, and that is foundational to our society. My favorite thing that I read this week was an article that said it is morally incoherent to work for climate justice without also working for racial justice. So fine and good, you might be saying racial justice is good, but why does that have to mean defunding the police? I think particularly on Juneteenth, when we celebrate the final arrival of the end of slavery to Texas and the political or legal liberation of the slaves remaining in this country. And as we know that was in some ways a liberation in name only, and that the policies and practices that allowed slavery to be possible continued through Jim Crow and the new Jim Crow and mass incarceration, that in this moment, it is critical that we follow the lead of the impacted community. We see that in the importance of climate justice. Listening to climate refugees tell us how we need to respond to the reality that they're already experiencing. And we see this now in the movement for Black lives. And so their demands this Juneteenth are that we call for the resignation of Donald Trump, that we defund the police, and that we invest in Black lives, Black futures, Black communities, Black thriving. And so making a world where everything can flourish means responding to this call from Black leaders to defund the police. And it really is a divest invest model, just like we see in the fossil-free movement with fossil-free PCUSA, that being fossil-free, as Abby has just talked about, that being in line with climate justice means moving our money, moving our treasure, and moving our hearts that live with it out of the death-dealing system of consumption and into life-giving communities of creativity and imagination and collaboration, things that look more like the kingdom of God. And that the call to defund the police calls us the same way, to move our hearts and our treasure and the treasure of our cities and our states and our county budgets out of a system that kills our neighbors with impunity and into imagining new ways of being in the world and of being community and of being the people of God, where all life is treated as equally important. Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who is a long-term advocate for abolition, says that where life is precious, life is precious. And I believe that as we lean into and move into a world and a system where we're not extracting resources and consuming them in order to fuel more extraction and consumption, where we're treating the life of the earth as precious, I believe that if we are called to love God with our whole selves and to love God's creation with our whole selves, we must recognize that Black and brown and Indigenous people, that all people of color are beautiful, precious, valued children of God. And if we're going to act like we really believe that is true, what we're being asked to do right now is to engage with and move toward defunding the police. I'm going to ask Emily to put a couple of resources in the Facebook comments, the Facebook live stream comments, and just encourage you both to listen to this podcast interview with Ruth Wilson Gilmore around abolition and start to imagine the ways that the world can be different, just as fossil-free PCUSA has been leading us for years and years to imagine how we can be different. And then also to visit the Movement for Black Lives Juneteenth page to find out how you can observe Juneteenth where you are, if you're not already planning to do that, and to learn more about the demands that they're making in this moment and that we're called to respond to. Thanks, Abby.
Thanks, Allie. In the work that we do for divestment from fossil fuels, we believe that where our treasure is, there our hearts are always. And now we've said that so many times on this call. And the thing about our hearts is that they are big enough to work for the liberation of so many things all at once, understanding that the liberation of some groups of people are tied up with the liberation of all of us. And until, as so many civil rights leaders have told us, until everyone is free, nobody is free. That remains true. It crosses all categories of difference, and it crosses all parts of creation. And it means that when we say that Black Lives Matter, that doesn't exclude that any other lives matter. It means that those are the lives that we need to protect and support. But as somebody who's white, saying that we need to do that, or we need to do this work on behalf of people of color and people who are Black and people who are Indigenous, we have to resist the language that we are helping people who are helpless. Instead, we come alongside, working for liberation of people who have been doing the work of liberation for generations. And we who are white come alongside to do that work for the liberation of all, knowing that when we dismantle white supremacy, we who are white will also be free. As we come towards the end of our time together, I want to thank you for spending this half hour with us. Thank you. We have a couple of asks, and the first is this. Engage with the resources that Alison mentioned to learn more about the movement for Black lives, and 2, join an event that observes Juneteenth. There are events happening in person, but if it's not safe for you to be in person because of the pandemic, there are also virtual events that you can participate in. So find ways to participate in Juneteenth and learn more about the movement for Black lives. Second, if you're a part of the Activist Council of Presbyterian Peace Fellowship or are already in our world, you have already heard about PPF's support for the call to defund the police. And Emily, maybe you can put that link in the Facebook live stream as well. And we invite you to learn more about that support as well, knowing that we continue to have the work to do to dismantle white supremacy and the racism in ourselves. And then last, we, in this time of a virtual General Assembly, pivoted in order to respond to virtual GA. We believe that we needed to have GA in a virtual way to protect the life and the health of so many people. And that meant that the overture, supported by over 30 presbyteries this time around, actually I think it was over 25, not over 30. That overture that called for categorical divestment from the fossil fuel industry will not be heard this year. And neither will the call from MRTI to divest from ExxonMobil, Marathon, and Valero. And so we understand that the work of social justice in the Presbyterian Church happens not just at General Assembly, but at all levels of the church. And so on August 19, Presbyterian Peace Fellowship and Fossil Free PCUSA is going to host a training for how you can get your presbytery to divest from fossil fuels. We don't need to wait for justice to happen at General Assembly. We can, as grassroots organizers, organize in our particular places and time to divest from fossil fuels and to reinvest in renewable energies and frontline communities so that climate justice can happen now. So in these last moments, I want to send us off with one of the ideas that Allie Molly just pulled or shared with us. And that is that all life is precious. When and where all life is precious. And so wherever you are, go into the world working so that all life is precious.